Hello, humans, and welcome back to the Drop Kennel podcast. Today, we are brought to you by the letter B, as in breed labeling and behavior. Here on the Drop Kennel podcast, we talk about all things shelter related, and we do so in the format of the shelter ABCs, where starting in alphabetical order, we cover topics that go on in a shelter based off of the letter of the week that we're on. So, last time we spoke about A, and that was advocacy and addiction. If you missed that one, feel free to join in and give it a listen. Otherwise, we're just going to jump into today's podcast. As a reminder, this podcast is for educational purposes only. It's based often off of my own experience of working in a shelter for the last 7 years as a behavior and enrichment manager. And it's also going to be based off some factual evidence that goes along with whatever we're talking about. And those scientific studies and facts and information come from our industry leaders, which is Maddie's Fund, the Humane Society of the US, the ASPCA, among a few others that really put forward the work and the data collection and the studies in order to get the most up-to-date and modern information on sheltering, as well as common behaviors, whether it be through cats, dogs, or people. And as one more reminder before we get started, humans are animals too, and I ask that we all respect each other no matter our species. So, let's do it. We're going to start with breed labeling. And in my preparation for researching this, I did come across a Reddit sub. And if you guys want to get angry and feel all sorts of feelings, you're more than welcome to go to Reddit and search breed labeling in shelters, and you'll get a whole thing about how not labeling a breed in a shelter can be very upsetting to people, and they can feel misled. That seemed to be the most popular argument within the pit bull variety of discussion. So I thought it was actually really eye-opening and very interesting. So I recommend anyone willing and within the right headspace to go check that out to do so, because it was unique perspectives. Some of it was rather upsetting though, but we'll get to that here in a hot second. What I want to start with is what breed labeling looks like within an animal shelter in general. I don't know how it is across the globe, but I do know in the US, many shelters are starting to utilize best practice of not breed labeling. Why is that? Well, more often than not, the majority of dogs that come into a shelter are mixed. They're going to be up to two, if not multiple, breeds of dogs all in one. So this nice little cauldron of unique breeds mixed into one to create this one unique, super cool individual. So we as shelter workers are not geneticists. We don't specialize in DNA, and we don't have the superpower to just look at an animal and make visual observations and then make a safe assumption to say it is a, bulldog, corgi, basset hound, chihuahua, which I've seen one of those, and they're super adorable, even though they can't breathe right. But that's not the point. The point is the kind of history of, back in the day, shelters would give it their best guess. And this was before we had DNA tests available to us as a consumer to be able to check what our pets are. So, it's anyone's best guess. And I think my favorite type of label if people do ask, because of course in the shelter a lot of adopters want to know what we think the animal is so they can best provide for it and have it be successful in their home. And there's this non-modern misconception now that if you know every breed that is in your dog, that you can manage it better. And I do see some truth in that. I myself got my dog's breed DNA tested when I first adopted her. I had a really good feeling that she was part Pyrenees. I just didn't know what else she was mixed with, because she was clearly not a full Pyrenees. And that was based off of my visual assumption. So see there's always going to be some conflicting approaches to this. But turns out she was a Pyrenees Border Collie mix, 50-50. And that certainly, could have helped me in how I did her recovery, because she was very, very fearful. But the knowledge of that didn't change the approach I took with her in helping her feel safe in her home and around people. Anytime I would go to do a CER plan, a conditioned emotional response with her on a training level, never did I consider like, well, a Pyrenees would, best be suited to be trained this way. No, I looked at her as the individual and looked at her behavioral problems as an individual, because they were individual to her and her experience, as well as her lack of socializing. So that had nothing to do with her breed. So, with that said, when a dog comes into a shelter, most shelter software nowadays has an option for you to kind of create your own kind of miscellaneous breed, because on the intake form, you do have to mark a breed on there. So, in order to do that, and to do that without having misinformation on their form that will follow them throughout, their lives with their owners, and to the vet and into doggy daycare or anywhere else where paperwork is required, like rentals and finding housing, it's best for shelters if we can. I think the cleanest way to do it is by size, and then by adding the word mix at the end of the size. Their weight that you get on intake, based off of that weight, you gauge whether they're a small, a medium, or a large mixed breed. And that's the only label they get. We're not going to throw in any assumptions of what we think it could be, especially those mixes where you really can't spot one specific breed shining through. So the studies that have been done through like Maddie's Fund and HSUS and ASPCA with breed labeling within the shelter walls and within that shelter experience have shown that when you do breed label, you can actually affect the animal's outcome in a negative way. So it's impactful in a negative way when you do breed label in the shelter setting. So to get in, a big blockhead, a big beefcake, if you will, and to just say, oh, it's a pit bull. Well, you've got the breed specific legislatures in some cities and counties, like Denver is a big one, obviously. And if you put pit bull on the paperwork, that's not going to be a good outcome for that dog. And especially if you're looking at that dog and they're behaviorally sound and they're very well balanced and they are just 100% good boy or girl, 100% good dog, one could say, then you single-handedly, and again, and it's never on purpose, but without not knowing, you end up putting this restriction and this boundary on this dog, that will follow it through the rest of its companionship, career and livelihood and pet. So that's why a lot of shelters have taken a step away from making assumptions and trying to assume what the breed is. So again, I'll just kind of go over that one more time. Most shelters are taking a step back from breed labeling. It has shown to be really beneficial for length of stay and our live release rate, which is a really fascinating piece of data that you can actually see. So I'll put in the description a few different links to some really fascinating collections of studies. One of my favorite ones is by Maddie's Fund, and they actually partnered with animalfarmfoundation.org, and we're able to compile a lot of data, and a lot of this data is based off of when shelters do callbacks with adopters, see how the animal's doing, and being able to see like, oh, we did do a DNA test and it's this and this. Or you call and they're like, we don't give a shit what breed it is, we don't need to know, all we know is that we love our dog. And I think that's information that speaks volumes and can really start to pave a really nice foundation and a really nice open door for conversation around why is it that we as humans find it so important to know exactly what breed it is when we're adopting? Now, I will not say that that's a blanket statement for people who own pets throughout, because there are people who want a specific breed because that breed is based off of the looks and the temperament that, you're looking for. So if you're looking for a standard poodle, you want a standard poodle. If you're going to a reputable breeder who's breeding responsibly and breeding really healthy bloodlines, healthy both from a holistic standpoint, so both from physical and emotional, psychological standpoints, yeah, you can get a really great dog. But we're not talking about that today. We are talking about breed labeling specifically in shelters. So, the other thing I want to hit on, when you do go into a shelter, there are certainly moments where the policy and the procedure around how to label a breed on intake, which again is going to be small, medium, or large mixed breed based off of their weight. There will be moments though where you will get a dog and it's, based off of our experience and knowledge, is very clearly a husky. But that husky may not have come in with paperwork stating it as such. And when that happens, we'll go ahead and say, like, this is a husky mix, because we don't have the paperwork proving that it's a purebred. So we're not going to assign that label to that dog without having that proof. But there's also that kind of political end and that community view end of things where we're not going to say it's a mixed breed and look like idiots when it's very clearly a husky to everyone who comes in to see it. And there's also that benefit with breeds like huskies, shepherds, poodles, Malinois, the smaller breeds that are like very clearly a pug. When you do put pug mix or husky mix into their file, their digital and their hard copy file, and then that goes on the website, yeah, you're going to attract the husky people, the pug people, whoever they, whatever breed people are out there. And those dogs then get to leave the shelter sooner as well, because that is a specific breed that people are looking for. So that's another piece of information to keep in mind, because then it can give the appearance that the shelter isn't consistent with their language. And I totally get that. And I remember when we sat down to kind of, zhuzh up our policy and our procedure around breed labeling upon intake and what it is that we call the animal, and having this very lengthy discussion on, because I think at that point in time, our ED was like, we need consistency. And I agree. Consistency and routine is key in a shelter if you want to keep your head above water. And language is very important. So we had this discussion of, no, even if it's a husky, we're going to say it's a large mix. And then one of our other admin employees was like, yeah, but we also work and we are professionals in knowledge around animals. So if we say this husky is a mixed breed, the community may lose trust in our ability to provide knowledge, because if we don't know that it's a husky, or we're pretending not to know it's a husky, we kind of look like idiots. So there is that piece to take into play as well. So there's a little bit of politics in there, basically. So that's something to keep in mind when you are an adopter and you're going to a shelter. And if you are looking for something specific on a breed standpoint, then let that be known when you meet with your adoption counselor. Let them know why. We can typically help counsel and talk you through, what temperament you're looking for because of this breed you have in mind. And hey, as it so happens, we don't have a German Shepherd, but we do have this mix that checks all the boxes of the temperament you're looking for based off of that breed. And then we can hopefully get that dog into that home and have it be an excellent, successful fit. So the other thing I wanted to talk to you about breed labeling and sort of labeling in general is just how saturated our lives have become with labeling everything. And a lot of that has to do with social media. And by a lot, I mean, it's probably all to do with social media. We have so many experts or soft experts or people who just happen to really love the study of, let's use psychology for an example, or wellness, or kind of that spiritual psychological connection. That's a thing that I follow a lot of on line, but I'm always very careful because I could very easily sit and doom scroll and then have like 8 labeled diagnoses from people who aren't even specialists within the field of mental health. So that carries through to breed labeling as well. And it carries through in the trainer world and in the behavior world. And mind you, behavior and training are 2 different things, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But you see online, trainers saying like, oh, if you have a German Shepherd, like you have to train them this way, or you have to do this. You cannot use, force-free or positive reinforcement. You have to use aversives because they were bred to do blah, blah, blah. And it's this label that's being placed upon this dog by humans that doesn't have a lot of data scientifically behind it, but does have historical data behind it. So with social media creating this platform and this availability for anyone and their moms and their dogs and their cats to just get online and say like, oh, I did this today. I stubbed my toe today, but I stubbed it at a, like right angle, and it made one muscle in my calf hurt more than the other. So when I went to WebMD, I discovered that I have something wrong with my neurological or whatever system. It hit a neuron that like did X, Y, and Z. I must be this type of ADHD now, all just because I stubbed my toe a certain way and I wanted to look it up online. I know that's a very hodgepodge example, but truthful in my perception. So that's something to keep in mind as well. I think we are all becoming addicted to labels, which is very fascinating to kind of sit back and watch and even partake in at times. I think another example, especially with me now being in my 40s, is waking up and feeling a certain way and then going online because I'm concerned of the intensity or the length in which I've been feeling a certain way. And then I come up with all of this information to be like, oh shit, I'm perimenopausal. And then confirming it with a doctor based off symptoms. So that's where all of these like really fine lines come into play where, yeah, you can get a lot of information about yourself or about your dog or about their breed or about their mix or about their training style, play style, how you should be training. And you can just pull all of these labels from the interweb to create a kind of like story for your animal or yourself, and then create ways to solve the story or end the story, or create the middle of the story, depending on where you're at in that pathway. So I think it's really interesting. It's something that I just kind of clock often, especially in the animal world, especially in sheltering and training and behavior, is just this race to come up with as many labels as you possibly can, or create new labels for things that have already been labeled, but now we're modernizing it, so we're gonna replace the word threshold with bubble and make it new. It's fascinating, but I digress. The other thing that I think is really important to note is that there are people out there, like I was mentioned earlier on a Reddit thread that I found, where a shelter stated, like, we're no longer breed labeling. And they had a picture of a pit bull that had a cute little blankie wrapped around her head. She kind of looked like E.T. And they said, instead of saying what we think she is, knowing full well that they will be 100% wrong with whatever breeds they pull into what they think her label is. Instead, they, said, she is a purebred, something like alien beefcake, blah blah, Hampshire style or whatever, making up names, which I love seeing shelters do that. I think it's very playful, and I think it's a great marketing tool to make it very sort of surface and whimsical. It just adds a new layer of personality to the dog, to attract an adopter. However, this thread that I found, holy moly, did people get very upset and felt like someone could go in and adopt, the ET looking dog, only to find out it could be a pit bull and then themselves be in danger. And this was based off of pit bull kind of rhetoric that was going on, how they're horrible dogs. And one person on the thread mentioned that in a very volatile and violent way that all pit bulls need to become extinct, and that will solve the world's dogfighting problem, which I thought was hilarious. I'm not even going to go into how I feel about that because I don't feel like wasting my breath on that because that is incorrect, and that's the bottom line. So when we are making these moves as shelters to start doing what's known as best practices, and best practices are always going to evolve based on the way that our environment changes. That's what evolution does. But finding this way to continue to not breed label, and also, find a way to help and educate those who get very upset over feeling misled. I don't know what that solution is other than just educating on mixed breeds and talking about, how incredible it is that most mixed breeds actually end up not having a ton of medical issues that a purebred does, or end up having better behavioral recovery, states than pure breeds. And that's not that, again, I'm not attacking pure breeds at all. I mean, there are breeds that I absolutely love. Guardian breeds are at the top of the heap there. I do love the Pyrenees and the Maremmas and the Akbashes and all of those. I mean, gimme. I am enthralled by them. I just think those animals are cool as shit. But I digress. When we're looking at that, if someone's going to feel misled when they're adopting, the majority of the time removing the label is what helps the most. But you are going to get that small percentage of people who desperately need to know the breed. And that could be because they're renting, and within their rental policy, there is a weight restriction or a breed restriction on an animal. And that's something else. That's another conversation entirely, of educating our lawmakers on, unless there is like an outbreak of pit bulls murdering people and having it be like this huge percentage happening within one community, which I haven't read anything like that, but I guess it could happen, but I doubt it. But if we're looking at really old and aged information, instead of looking at the evolution of the information and where we're at now in a modern day, that label can really impact that dog who happens to have a blocky head very negatively. So that is why shelters are stepping away from breed labeling. And that is why I support helping other shelters come to that realization as to why you should stop breed labeling. Even if you say it's a lab mix, or it's a shepherd mix, or it's a husky mix, and you're just guessing. A lot of pit bulls will be labeled as a lab mix. And that is helpful for sure. But that's where I feel like a lot of this smaller percentage of people who feel misled can maybe come into play and maybe get a little bit of relief from their own fears and misconceptions by just saying, removing the mix, the top tier mix we think it is. So just by doing it by size, I think could be really helpful for a lot of shelters moving forward. So that's my little nugget on breed labeling. I'd love to hear y'all's input. This will be the first episode that's going to go up on YouTube as well, so commenting will be available. So I'd love to hear what your opinion is, and what your shelter does, and why, and how they came to that realization, and when they started to remove breed labels. Again, I will put a couple really cool studies and infographics in the links to those infographics in the description, so you guys can give it a read and follow along if you would like. The one that is my favorite is the Breed Labels ebook from Maddie's Fund. They have a ton of incredible ebooks that you can download for free and utilize as training tools within your shelters, and I highly suggest that you do. They're just incredible tools to have in the building. But now we're going to move on to our second topic. And that second topic is behavior. Now, this one I had a hard time kind of narrowing down what exactly I wanted to talk about it, because it is very vast. So I've got about 4 little bullet points that I'm going to hit on. The first is what does the behavior department do in a shelter? Most shelters have a behavior department. Within those departments, depending on your budget and type of shelter, so whether you are a nonprofit or municipal or private. Um, so if you got a big budget in a private shelter and you're able to have like a team of behavior specialists and trainers within your behavior department, number one, I'm jelly. Number two, you can do a lot of good within that department with those numbers. I'm going to talk about my experience, though, within my shelter. Our average yearly intake is anywhere between 3,800 and 4,200, kind of depending on the year. And that's dogs and cats. And that's surrenders, strays, section twos, and everything in between. So with that number, and with us being a nonprofit, we only had the budget capability to have myself as the behavior and enrichment manager, and then we were able to add a behavior associate. We didn't do that until a couple years ago. Before that, it was me and my mentor. And Ben, if you are listening, hi, love you. But it was just us, and we really had to kind of hodgepodge together what it would be, what our job description was, and what our day in and day out was for the behavioral wealth and well-being of the animals in the building. So we ended up splitting it where my mentor would focus on all the dogs that were already adopted out, and he would be consulting and training and really working with those adopters and working with potential people who were wanting to bring their dogs into the building to surrender. So he would do a lot of intake diversion counseling as well. My focus became the animals in the building. So focusing on doing BMOD and getting their evaluations done, and getting their dog intros done, and just essentially creating their pathway to adoption. So what that looks like now that I have left, but the gal who replaced me is amazing at the shelter. I think they're about to hire their new behavior associate, so that is great. There's going to be 2 people under the behavior department umbrella. So with that, what you are tasked with each day is to do canine rounds. And that looks like walking through the building in the morning with a clipboard, making notes of all the animals in the building, where they're at in their pathway process. If it's a stray, you walk through the stray holding area, and you may have one that hit its 5-day hold, and we haven't had any information from any owners. No one's claimed it. So that dog now is legally ours by our contract that we have with animal control. And then you mark note that that dog now needs a name and now can get its dog intro, get its behavior evaluation, and then get spayed or neutered and get its medical evaluation, and then move to the adoption floor. So you do rounds. That's how you get your kind of like overview of what your day is going to look like. And even though you got that overview of what your day is going to look like, it never looks like that, because as we know, especially in the shelter world, it is impossible to make like a ticket list of what you want to get done for the day and expect yourself to get those things done. It's not going to happen. You may not even get one of those things done, depending on what's coming in the building. But that's neither here nor there for this topic. So again, the behavior department is going to do their rounds in the morning, check in on every dog, kind of take an inspection of what their kennel looks like in the morning. Are they defecating? Does it look like they're wall climbing or drooling or knocking their water bucket over? Are they eating their blankets or tearing their blankets or tearing up their toys? And we make adjustments based off of what we see visually to help with whatever behaviors are going on overnight that are causing them distress. Then I would go to my office. I would have a stack of files. We color coordinated our species. Dogs were blue, cats were red. So we had blue files for all the dogs. I would go through and see where each dog was within the building, within their holding kind of period, and what they needed in order to move forward. So a big piece of the behavior department is ensuring that these dogs and cats get moved through the pathway process as quickly as possible. So that includes every dog needs to have a dog intro where they meet another dog, and we observe objectively what behaviors we see, just in case we need to do any sort of behavioral flag of any sort. And then we do their behavior evaluation. The evaluations are very fascinating and very fun, and those have evolved greatly over the last decade. There used to be a standardized test called SAFER, and there are a couple other ones that are named as well, where you would do a series of tests on the animals to gauge their behavior and temperament. Those have recently, within the last 8 years, 8 or 5 or 8 years, really started to disappear. And what's being replaced with that is certainly standardized, but it's standardized per shelter and per approach of how you want the animals to be observed objectively. Because it's not good to do subjective behavior evaluations, because those are not going to be accurate. Those are going to be based off of your emotions, and that's not cool. So what we started doing was this really nice holistic approach where we would gather any historical data we had on the dog. We would gather all the information from our animal care specialists and what their experience with the dog has been like so far, and how the dog was on intake, how it's been in the mornings going out to go potty, if it's eating properly, if it's pooping and peeing outside, letting us know how they have seen the dog through their experience with them as their most consistent and daily handlers. And then they get, hopefully 10 minutes with me one-on-one, where I can just observe how they do in a new room, how they do engaging with me, if it's food related, if it's toy related, if it's affection related, and how quickly they can recover in new environments. Because that, to me, is the most important piece of the observation process, is to get a good sense of how the dog is going to be when they get into their new home environment. So that's something else we look at. The other pieces of the behavior department are, at least for us, providing enrichment. Some shelters have separate departments, so a behavior department and an enrichment department, and that I'm really jealous of. But within our shelter, um, setting and capacity for care, it would be delulu to think that we could have two different departments at the moment. I think that's something that will happen for sure for them over time, which will be very exciting to watch from a distance. So we provide enrichment, and then we also are tasked with the worst part, which is flagging dogs who have behaviors that don't meet our adoptability criteria. For any shelters out there listening, if you don't have an adoptability criteria written, not only from you, but from the board to the ED down, or if you are private from, the CEO, or if you are municipal, whatever contract you have in place of what makes an adoptable dog, I suggest you have it in writing. That's, I think, the most important thing you can do for consistency and routine, as well as help when you do get to the point where you get to the outcomes meeting for the week. And if you can't make a decision, it's great to have something in writing to help you recognize what the decision needs to be. For those of you listening who have no idea what I'm talking about right now, this, again, like I said, is the hardest part of the job, where the lead behavior team member, lead medical or vet med, your operations director, and then your lead animal care person come to a meeting once a week where we discuss what animals should and should not go through to be adoptable. So that's based off of medical cases, and that's also based off behavioral cases. We will have a separate episode when we get to the letter N, talking about no-kill shelters and what that actually means. So this might be a little jarring to hear in this moment right now, but we are a no-kill shelter, the one I worked at, meaning we don't kill for space or length of stay. We do euthanize if we do have a dangerous animal, or a behavioral case where the quality of life of the animal will, based off of our professional opinion and observation, and based off of that animal's history, will be behaviorally euthanized. And that can be a quality of life issue. It can be a safety issue. Those are the main two kind of pillars that we base this off of. And then, of course, there's the medical side of things. If there's an incurable disease going on, or if an animal is so ill and we don't have the resources to treat it, then that becomes a quality of life question as well. So that's the hardest part of the behavior department job. it sucks. And we'll have another episode where maybe I get into that more on a personal level. But today we're going to avoid that. To be perfectly honest, I'm not in the headspace to deep dive into that right now. But that's one piece of behavior when it comes to sheltering. I also want to talk about a really important piece as well is how does behavior differ in shelter versus in the home? That's a big part of the behavior evaluation process that I consider is, okay, the behaviors I'm seeing right now, whether it's over arousal or not wanting to take treats, not wanting to engage, walking around with your little tail tucked, and being quite fearful, or quite the opposite, being quite offensive or defensive. But if I look at the paperwork and I see that those behaviors were not prevalent in a historical manner, so they did not present that way in the home, that gives me a good inkling that these behaviors that I'm seeing are in shelter behaviors. And then you have your in home behaviors. What that can tell us, though, as counselors to potential adopters is that, hey, their behavior here did not match their behavior in their previous home. So we can assume that they're going to be environmentally sensitive. What that tells me as a counselor to an adopter is, hey, you're going to want to give your dog, a lot of time to decompress and refamiliarize with this new home and build a bond with you before you go do all the dog things that you think you're supposed to do right when you adopt the pet. I cannot tell you how many adopters, and this is by no means in any fault of their own, you're so excited when you are in the shelter. When you go into the shelter, you're either having the best day of your life because you're adopting or the worst day of your life because you're surrendering. But if you're having the best day of your life, you're so excited that you tend to just become a bobblehead when you are talking to your adoption counselor or talking to the behavior specialist in the building in the event that you're adopting a behavior consultant dog, meaning that you have to talk to the behavior team member before adopting the dog, making sure that you have all the tools and management that you need to help the dog thrive and succeed with you. But you're so freaking excited. You're not here. You're like blacking out and not hearing a word we're saying, even though we're saying, hey, don't go to PetSmart immediately and like let the dog pick out toys. They're really fearful of new environments, and they don't know you yet. So take it slow. Just go home. Let them find their own safe corner and let them decompress. Don't be surprised if they sleep for 3 days straight. Don't be surprised if they don't eat for the first few days or pee for the first few days or hold in their poop for a week. Um, all of those things can happen, and all of those things are based off of this behavior and this idea of being environmentally sensitive to new novel environments. So that's where we look at that in shelter behavior and that in home behavior, and how fascinating it is. Once a confident dog who might have over arousal in the shelter then goes home and goes, that arousal level is regulated because they're in a house, they're not in a stressful shelter. But to get back to what I was talking about in regards to counseling with people and them not hearing you, and then even though you just said, don't go to PetSmart, don't let all your friends come over and meet this fearful dog right off the bat. Like, please let them decompress. Give them at least 3 weeks to really get a nice feeling of safety and trust with you and its space. And then instead, they immediately take it to PetSmart, immediately take it to the dog park, have all of their friends and family over to meet the dog. And then they call the next day being like, this dog hasn't moved and it's shaking in the corner and it's whale eyeing me. And what do I do? So what you do, people out there who aren't shelter workers, but who are looking to adopt, please listen to us when we are giving you that advice. We're not doing it just to like have ourselves like listen to our voices and be egotistical. We're doing it because it's important information and could really set you up for success right off the bat, so you don't have to take any steps back to begin to build a trust bond with your dog and your cat. That goes for kitties as well. So that's another piece of that behavior in the shelter, if it's shelter behavior or in-home behavior. And then I do want to talk really quickly. I'm going to do brief on this, but how does behavior differ from obedience training? So a behavior specialist, just so you guys know, focuses more on the behavior that the animal's presenting and what problems it may be causing the animal. So an example is separation anxiety. If your dog experiences separation anxiety, you can certainly use training or obedience training as a tool but you're not going to be treating the underlying behaviors and emotions that are causing that behavior of whining or ripping off baseboards or, chewing through their kennel or even getting so extreme that they cause some self-harm. So for those of you out there looking for behavior help for your dog, I would suggest finding a science-based trainer who specializes in behavior or psychology, as well as a behaviorist. So that's on the medical end. That's going to be your veterinary behaviorists, and going at your dog's behavior modification from an approach that's very holistic, and you're hitting all of these different tools in order to help the dog emotionally. And again, those different tools are people who specialize in behavior and people who specialize in obedience training, and bringing them all together and working as one fluid team. That has not been the case in many cases that I've taken on, but hopefully that will change and there will be a better acceptance within the dog training and the behavior community where we can all work together for the sake of the dog. But that's that. The other thing I wanted to touch on before we finish up for the day is, how do people behave in a shelter? So I do want to take a look at the human behavior in shelters, whether it's the shelter workers or, the shelter employees, or the people coming into the shelter, whether you're an adopter or surrendering your pet. Like I said earlier, people in shelters, the emotional aspect of it is polarizing. If you're coming into the shelter as a non-employee, so as a community member, it's either the best day of your life or the absolute worst day of your life. If it's the best day, you're coming in to adopt a kitten, a cat, a dog, a puppy, and you're having the best day. But the person standing right behind you in the lobby is having the absolute worst day of their life. They are needing to choose to surrender their kitten, cat, puppy, or dog to us for whatever reason, and whatever reason that is welcome. There shouldn't be judgment, but I have found that when employees meet the people who are having the worst day with judgment, that is when shit gets real prickly. And of course, the person who's having their worst day is going to react in a negative way. I think that's basic human psychology. You meet someone with a negative energy, the chances of them meeting you back with negative energy are pretty high, unless that person has spectacular regulation skills and can then meet you with kindness. And what I call the Care Bear stare. Yay for 80s babies. But that's not always the case. I always joke that I know a lot of people say what changes human behavior the most are two specific events, and those are weddings and funerals. I like to add pets in that sentence. So weddings, funerals, and anything related to animals can bring out the absolute cuckoo bananas of people, including myself. I've seen it happen to myself. I have felt it happen to myself, and I've seen it happen with members of our community who come into the shelter. So I think it's a fascinating thing to dig into about how you as a shelter employee can really shift the dynamic of your interaction with the person, the community member coming into the building, into a positive one. But you are the one that needs to start it. You're the representative for the situation at hand, and you're the representative for the shelter. And I think because pets hit so different, and when you have people working within this industry, there's a level of passion within each individual that is so heightened, and rightly so. I am not disputing that it should be anything other. But what I am wondering is what would happen. I'd be fascinating if a shelter wanted to do some sort of human study, and soft study of, for 1 week, let's all be very consistent with our language, but more important, let's all be very consistent with our attitude towards the people who come into the building. And let's see if we can even feel the energy shift within the building. Meaning, instead of meeting someone with a, hey, what can I do for you? Meeting someone with a, hey, welcome in. What do you need today? And if they are surrendering your pet, instead of saying, oh, here's the paper you need to fill out, I'll take your dog if you're ready. Instead, saying, I'm so sorry, I'm so happy, that you're here, doing what's best for you and your dog. I'm happy to help you out through this. Here's some paperwork. I'm going to lead you to a private room. So you take your time and fill out the paperwork. And if you need anything, just let me know. And there are Kleenex in here. I walk them through the process of, you'll fill this out when you're done. I'm going to go through it with you. We're going to discuss some of the behavioral things I may see or reasonings why you have to bring your pet to us today. And then we'll get you out of here as quickly as possible, because I know this is so uncomfortable and so upsetting. So meeting them with that empathy and compassion instead of judgment. And do that for a week straight. Tell all of your employees, like, that is the expectation. Let's meet this. Let's do it as a challenge for 1 week. Because there's always of those, few people that cannot hide their, our BF or their judgment or their feelings around why an animal is being surrendered. And there are also those employees who cannot hide their feelings when they are adopting an animal out to someone who's having the best day of their life because they're adopting their new companion and their best friend. But the shelter worker doesn't think it's a good fit. So they give them attitude and they make it very difficult to even get the process done. And they just have the tone of like, don't you dare like introduce this dog to any other dogs for the rest of its life. No, don't do that. Just don't. It's just mean. It's judgy. It's ick. I don't like it. And we always had a couple, people who would work at the shelter. And of course, with animal care, you have high ass turnover. So you'd have like 4 months with one with one team where it would just be stellar. These people would get it. They would understand sheltering. They would understand the language that needs to be used, and they would love what they do. And then you would, 2 of them would quit, and then 2 would come in and they would not get it and would be very passionate in a way that actually caused some toxicity within the work culture. And that happens. It's going to happen anywhere. It definitely happens in the shelter, and it makes for a very difficult day to day going to your job if you are being targeted by those people. Me being in the behavior department and having to be one who has a consultative and sometimes a decisive voice on behavior euthanasia would bear the brunt of some really nasty, in my case, mean girl shit. We didn't have a ton of males working at the shelter. But again, that's neither here nor there. I spoke very briefly about that in the last episode, and how painful it is. But I'm not a victim of it. It's part of the job. It's part of the territory. But I do think it's important to bring up that when you have attitudes like that in the shelter, it's going to affect the behavior throughout the shelter with the humans, which then trickles down to affect the behavior of the animals in the building. So when you've got 400 heartbeats in the building, the majority of them are cats and dogs, and the minority are people. And the people have the stronger kind of energy field, and they're behaving like cacas. You better believe it's going to add stress and kind of texture, that type of stressful texture to the energy in the building. In case you guys haven't recognized yet, I am a spiritual woo-woo person, proudly. But there would be days where you would walk into the shelter and it would feel like you were walking through like a cloak of darkness, and you knew automatically that that day was going to be tough. And it was really hard to try and reverse. So for those of you, even if you aren't on that like kind of woo-woo end, witchy end like I am, I'd be curious to hear your perspective of when you feel energy shifts in your building and how you handle it. Because I think it's very truthful and very accurate. Maybe I'm crazy. Anywho, that's sort of my long rant on how people behave in shelters. You definitely get the really intense community members who are very angry, especially if they are coming to pick up their stray animal that they were able to come get that we found, but they're mad that they have to pay a reclaim fee, or they're mad that we by contract have to vaccinate at least all the dogs with Bordetella, which is the kennel cough vaccine. Man, we have had a lot of disputes over that with our community members. And I think my favorite part of working in a shelter is how much I got to sharpen my diffusing skills. Uh, Being a makeup artist in my past life, I would definitely be quite literally face to face with like very angry people at times if they didn't like their winged eyeliner or if they didn't like the way I did their eyebrows, and it would just be instant like anger and reaction. And I started to kind of fall in love with diffusing situations like that. That's a high for me for sure. So I'm so grateful to sheltering because you are faced with very emotional people every single day. And those emotions can range from pure excitement and happiness to absolute sadness and, um, you know, anger. And then the even extreme, the more anger, where there's like threats going on and all sorts of shits going down. So if you have that type of personality where you love diffusing things and you love animals and you can handle the shit that goes with that job, I highly recommend working in animal sheltering. I don't know if I sold that very well. Anyway, you guys, I'll end it there. I know I always tend to ramble here towards the end, and by always, this is only the second episode, but the ones I've recorded um, for the future, this is just what I do. So thanks for listening, and thanks for listening all the way through. Again, this is the Drop Kennel podcast. Today, we wrapped up the letter B on breed labeling and behavior. I hope you all learned something or were given a different, fresh perspective, especially for those shelter workers out there who are listening. I hope this provided some sort of think again experience or shift in perspective, or at least just opportunity to engage in a different perspective. And I hope all of you go along your weekend. It is Sunday, which means it's Shelter Sunday for me. That's when the podcast is going to be out moving forward. From here on out will be Sundays. But I hope you enjoyed today. I am really pumped for next week when we get to the letter C. It'll be a more emotional one. We're going to talk about capacity for care, and we're going to talk about compassion fatigue. So get ready for that one. It's going to be gruff for sure, but hopefully informational and validating, because we don't talk about that enough. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed, and I will see y'all next week, or I will hear y'all. Y'all will hear me next week. As always, just remember that humans are animals too, and just because we have a unique cognitive ability to function differently in the world does not entitle us to be assholes to any creature anywhere. All right. Bye, guys.